The topic for this video is Module 3, Inputs and Tools, Chapter 6, Economics of International Trade for the CFA Institute Investment Foundations program. So here we are in Module 3, Inputs and Tools, and today's video is on Chapter 6, Economics of International Trade, and you can see that there are 47 questions in the learning ecosystem. Recall there are 50 learning outcome statements for this module. There are 9 learning outcome statements for this chapter. The 9 learning outcome statements for this chapter are Learning Outcome Statement A, define imports and exports and describe the need for and trends in imports and exports. LOS B, describe comparative advantage among countries. C, describe the balance of payments and explain the relationship between the current account, the capital account, and financial account. D, describe why a country runs a current account deficit and describe the effects of a current account deficit on the country's currency. E, describe types of foreign exchange rate systems. F, describe factors affecting the value of a currency. G, describe how to assess the relative strength of currencies. H, describe foreign exchange rate quotes. And I, compare spot and forward markets. Learning Outcome Statement A is define imports and exports and describe the need for and trends in imports and exports. So countries have been trading with each other for centuries, and the primary mode of international trade is imports and exports. Imports refer to products and services that are produced outside a country's border and then brought into the country. So, for example, many countries in the European Union import natural gas from Russia. Exports refer to products and services that are produced within a country's borders and then transported to another country. For example, Japan exports consumer electronics to the rest of the world. Now we're looking at the need for and benefit of international trade. Okay, we're going to start up here with looking at the gaining access to resources. So a common reason why a country wants to trade is to gain access to resources for which there is no or insufficient supply domestically. For example, Japanese manufacturers need access to commodities such as metals and minerals, machinery and equipment, and fuel to be able to produce automobiles and consumer electronics that they then export to the rest of the world. Because there is insufficient supply of some of these resources in Japan, international trade is a way for Japanese manufacturers to gain access to those resources. They may import metals and minerals from Australia, Canada, and China, machinery and equipment from Germany, and fuel from the Middle East. International trade creates additional demand for domestic products and services. So now we're moving down to this quadrant. For example, if Japanese manufacturers did not have the ability to sell consumer electronics abroad, they would have to limit their production to the quantity that can be consumed in Japan, a relatively small market. This lowers production. That would translate into lower sales and lower profits for the Japanese manufacturers, which would probably have a negative effect on the Japanese economy. GDP may be lower and unemployment higher. International trade also provides consumers with a greater choice of goods and services. It gives consumers access to goods and services that may not be available domestically. For example, consumers in the United Kingdom would not be able to enjoy bananas or a cup of tea if importing these products was not possible. Consumers may gain access to goods and services that better suit their needs. Imported products may be cheaper and of better quality than domestically produced ones. Okay? So now we're moving over to this quadrant. By enhancing competitiveness between suppliers of the goods and services, international trade promotes higher efficiency, which helps keep prices down. International trade also stimulates innovation, which generates better quality goods and services. Now we're moving on to trends in imports and exports. So you can see 2 major trends have promoted international trade. Number 1 is fewer trade barriers, And number 2 is better transportation and communications. So if we look at 3 examples of trade barriers, the first one is tariffs. What are tariffs? They're taxes levied on imported products or services that allow governments not only to establish trade barriers, often to protect domestic suppliers, but also to raise revenue. A second type of trade barrier is with regards to quotas. Quotas are limits placed on the quantity of products that can be imported. And a third type of barrier are non-tariff barriers, and a range of barriers such as certification, licensing, sanctions, or embargoes that make it more difficult and expensive for foreign producers to compete. Moving over here to the second major trend that have promoted international trade, better transportation and communications. Large shipping containers allow manufacturers to transport non-perishable products more easily on ships. Okay, we see these mega container ships. And trains, trucks, and jumbo jets also transport perishable products more quickly. The second trend is with regards to communications. The ability to communicate digitally has also contributed to the increase in the trade of services. Learning outcome statement B is describe comparative advantages among countries. So we're going to have 3 slides with regards to this learning outcome statement. This first slide is going to look at absolute advantage, and then we're going to look at comparative advantage on the next 2 slides. Okay? So rather than producing everything internally, countries often specialize in goods and services they can produce relatively more efficiently than other countries. They then trade these goods and services in which they have a comparative advantage for other goods and services that another country can produce more efficiently. According to the theory of comparative advantage, countries export goods and services in which they have a comparative advantage, and they import goods and services in which they do not have a comparative advantage. Okay, so we're going to be looking at comparative advantage in the next slide. The combination of specialization and international trade ultimately benefit all countries, leading to a better allocation of resources and increased wealth. So we're going to consider the cases of these 2 countries, country A and country B. Okay, where there's demand for 2 different goods, we're going to look at shoes and kettles. Okay, and so what this chart is showing is the number of units of labor required to produce each product. So for simplicity, assume that making shoes and kettles takes the same amount of resources except for labor. Okay, so we can see that the difference is the units of labor. So the number of units of labor it takes in each country to make shoes and kettles is shown in the exhibit. It may appear that there's no reason why country A would want to trade with country B, because country A is able to produce both shoes and kettles more cheaply than country B. You can see here country A, it takes 10 units of labor to make the shoes, and it takes 10 units of labor to make the kettles, which is less than country B, where it's taking 20 units of labor to produce the shoes, and it's taking 40 units of labor to produce kettles. So you can see for both shoes and kettles, country A has an absolute advantage in terms of cost over country B in the production of both shoes and kettles. So country A can produce both shoes and kettles for just 10 units of labor, whereas shoes takes 20 units and kettles take 40 units in country B. So an absolute advantage, therefore, is when a country is more efficient in producing a good or a service than other countries. That is, it needs fewer resources to produce the goods and services. This slide now we're going to look at the comparative advantage. So recall the previous slide, we're looking at absolute advantage, and country A had absolute advantage for producing both shoes and kettles because the number of units of labor required to produce each product was less. So in country A, 10 units of labor to produce shoes is less than 20 units of labor in country B. To produce kettles, 10 units of labor is less than 40 units of labor required in country B to make the kettles. Okay, so for both shoes and kettles, country A had the absolute advantage. But now we're going to move on to this concept of comparative advantage, and what we need to look at here is this last column looking at the cost ratio. Okay, so according to the theory of comparative advantage, both countries would be better off if country A makes kettles and country B makes shoes. Okay, and we're going to explain why. It takes the same number of units of labor to produce shoes and kettles in country A. Thus, making an additional kettle requires giving up the production of one pair of shoes in country A. In contrast, it takes twice the number of units of labor to produce kettles than to produce shoes in country B. You can see 40 units here to produce a kettle of labor, 20 units to produce the shoes. Thus, making an additional kettle requires giving up the production of 2 pairs of shoes in country B. The foregone opportunity cost to make an additional kettle is less in country A, 1 pair of shoes, than in country B, 2 pairs of shoes. Therefore, country A is more efficient than country B at producing an additional kettle. Country A also has what is called a comparative advantage in making kettles. In our example, the opportunity cost of making a kettle is 1 pair of shoes in country A and 2 pairs of shoes in country B. Okay? Similarly, the opportunity cost of making a pair of shoes is 1 kettle in country A and half a kettle in country B. Thus, country B has a comparative advantage in producing shoes compared with country A. Okay, so we're studying absolute and comparative advantage. On this last slide, we're going to work through a little example, which I think should help consolidate your understanding. If you haven't studied economics before, learning about absolute and comparative advantage can be a little bit tricky the first time you run through it. So in terms of the absolute advantage, I think that's really easy to understand. Country A had an absolute advantage in producing both shoes and kettles based on the fact that it takes less units of labor required to produce each product. So 10 units of labor in country A to produce shoes is less than 20 units of labor to produce shoes in country B. And 10 units of labor to produce a kettle in country A is also less than 40 units of labor to produce a kettle in country B. But then we moved on to so that country A has an absolute advantage regarding country B in terms of the production of both shoes and kettles because it consumes less labor. Then we moved on to comparative advantage, and we move on to comparative advantage. We look at the cost ratio. And so the key there is that when we look at a country, so here, country A, there was a 1-to-1 cost ratio, that's fine. Country B, there was a 1-to-2 cost ratio, meaning that it took twice as many units of labor to produce a kettle. So therefore, they should specialize in making shoes because it takes less units of labor. So we're going to look for the lower number in the ratio, and that's what the country should specialize in. So if you think about it like that, it kind of makes sense. What are we going to specialize on? Should we make shoes or kettles? Well, it takes less labor to make shoes. Let's make shoes, okay? But what we're going to do is we're going to look at an example here. Let's say the starting point is where country A is making 1 pair of shoes, country and 1 kettle, and country B is making 1 pair of shoes and 1 kettle. So the starting point is country A and B are making 2 pairs of shoes and making 2 kettles, okay? But our example implies that country A should specialize in making kettles, country B should specialize in making shoes. Country A and B should trade with each other to gain access to the good that the other country produces more efficiently. So if we start with country A and we shift 10 units of labor to producing kettles instead of shoes, okay, so we're going to move these 10 units over here, we can see that it'll make 1 less pair of shoes, but 1 more kettle, okay? So this will go down now to 1 pair of shoes. It's just in country B, but now we're going to be at 3 kettles, okay? Now, if country B shifts its 40 units of labor to making shoes instead of kettles, it'll produce 1 less kettle. So we're going to shift these 40 units over here. So we're going to make 1 less kettle. So we're back to the 2 kettles, but we're going to be able to make 2 pairs of shoes. So we're at 3 pairs of shoes, okay? So that's minus 1 kettle. It's for plus 2 sets of shoes. So you can see we started with 2 pairs of shoes and 2 kettles, but by specializing our production, we're now at 3 pairs of shoes and 2 kettles. We've gained an extra. The net effect is that the total kettle production by both countries A and B is unchanged, but there's now an additional pair of shoes produced. So the combination of specialization and international trade maximizes productivity in both countries, which ultimately benefits both economies. Okay, so hopefully that helped you. You may have to work your way through it once or twice going through the chapter. But again, absolute advantage, lesser number of units of labor. Comparative advantage, you're looking for the cost ratio. You're obviously going to make the item that takes the lesser resources in terms of labor in this example. And then finally, by specializing in trading, you can see by moving from producing kettles that was using 40 units of labor into shoes for country B, and then trading, we went from a starting point of 2 pairs of shoes and 2 kettles to a situation where we had 3 sets of shoes, pairs of shoes, and 2 kettles. So we were actually able to increase, there's now an additional pair of shoes that were produced through specialization in trade. Learning outcome statement C is describe the balance of payments and explain the relationship between the current account and the capital and financial account. Okay? So the balance of payments shows the flow of money in and out of a country as a result of exports and imports of products and services. It also reflects financial transactions and financial transfers between resident and non-resident economic entities. Okay? Economic entities include individuals, companies, governments, and government agencies. Resident entities are based in the country, domestic, whereas non-resident entities are based in other countries, foreign. So analyzing a country's balance of payments helps in understanding a country's macroeconomic environment. Questions that can be answered by analyzing a country's balance of payments include, how much does a country consume and invest compared with how much it saves? And does the country depend on foreign capital to fund its consumption and investments? The balance of payments includes 2 accounts, the current account and the capital and financial account. Now we're moving on to look at the components of the current account, okay? So a positive current account balance is called a current account surplus, and a negative current account balance is called a current account deficit. The current account has 3 subaccounts. Number 1, the goods and services subaccount is usually the largest of the 3 subaccounts. It reflects the flow of money in and out of the country as a result of trade of goods and services. It includes exports of goods and services from domestic entities to foreign entities. The difference between exports and imports of goods and services is called net exports. It may also be referred to as the balance of trade or trade balance, okay? If the value of exports is higher than the value of imports, i.e. if net exports are positive, the country has a trade surplus. Inflows are exceeding the outflows. Alternatively, if the value of exports is lower than the value of imports, i.e. net exports are negative, the country has a trade deficit. Outflows exceed inflows, okay? Moving on to subaccount number 2, the income subaccount reflects the flow of money in and out of the country from salaries and income from financial investments. For example, if a domestic company has a debt or equity investment in a foreign company, any income, such as interest payments or debt or dividend payments on equity received by the domestic company, is included in the income subaccount of the current account. Note that the original cash flow for financial investments is in the foreign company's debt or equity, which represents the ownership of these assets, are included in the capital and financial account, okay? So finally, the third subaccount is the current transfers. The current transfer subaccount includes unilateral transfers such as gifts or workers' remittance. Gifts of aid from one country are outflows for that country and inflows for the receiving country. Money sent home by migrant workers is an outflow from the country where they work and an inflow to the country to which it is sent. A positive current account balance is called a current account surplus. A negative current account balance is called a current account deficit. For most countries, net exports represent a larger amount than the sum of the income and current transfer subaccounts. In other words, the trade balance trend tends to dominate the current account balance. So countries that have a trade surplus because they export more than they import tend to have a current account surplus. And countries that have a trade deficit because they import more than they export tend to have a current account deficit. So very quickly on this slide, it's a table that's in the text. We're looking at countries with the largest current account surplus or deficit, and this goes back to 2013. So the countries that have a large current account surpluses, Germany, China, Saudi Arabia, Netherlands, and Russia, that means these countries are saving. The countries have more inflows than outflows, okay? These countries have the ability to lend to other countries. Then we're looking at the countries that have a large current account deficits, and these countries are consuming and investing more than it is receiving. And that's the case for the United States, United Kingdom, Brazil, India, and Canada, as listed in the table. Thus, these countries need to borrow money from other countries. Continuing with the balance of payments, we're now going to look at the capital and financial accounts. Okay, the capital and financial account have two subaccounts. The capital subaccount primarily reports capital transfers between domestic entities and foreign entities, such as debt forgiveness or the transfer of assets by migrants entering and leaving the country. The financial subaccount reflects the types of investments domestic entities make in foreign entities, as well as the type of investments foreign entities make in domestic entities. The financial subaccount has four components: direct investments, long-term investments between domestic entities and foreign entities; portfolio investments, which is the purchase and sales of securities, such as debt and equity securities between domestic entities and foreign entities; other investments, largely made up of loans and deposits between domestic entities and foreign entities; and finally, the reserve account, which are transactions made by the monetary authorities of a country, typically the central bank. This slide is looking at the relationship between current account and capital and financial account. Okay, so how does a country with a current account surplus invest its savings, and how does a country with a current account deficit fund its needs? The current account indicates whether a country has a surplus or a deficit and why. The capital and financial account identifies how the surplus is invested or how the deficit is funded. The sum of the current account balance and the capital and financial account balance is, in theory, equal to zero. The capital flows move in the opposite direction of the goods and services flows that give rise to them. Thus, if a country has a current account surplus, it will have a capital account and financial account deficit. The country is a net saver and ends up being a net lender to the rest of the world, and vice versa. In practice, the current account balance will not be exactly offset by the capital and financial account balance because of measurement errors, okay? Thus, there's the need for a plug figure, and it's called errors and omissions. All the items reported in the balance of payments must be measured independently by using different sources of data. So, for example, data are collected from customs authorities on exports and imports, from surveys of tourist numbers and expenditures, and from financial institutions on capital inflows and outflows. Some of the inputs are based on sampling techniques, so the resulting figures are their estimates. So in practice, it is rare, if not impossible, to end up with the capital and financial account balance exactly offsetting the current account balance, okay? So there's a need for a plug figure, and it's called errors and omissions, and that makes the sum of all the items in the balance of payments equal to zero. So here's a practice question from the learning ecosystem, and it's at the expert level, okay? So the question is, in the following situation, which country would report an export? Number one, Pat, an auto retailer in Ireland, purchased a car stereo from its manufacturer in Japan. Number two, A U.S. toothpaste manufacturer allows its product to be manufactured by a Kenyan firm under license. The Kenyan firm is restricted to selling the product domestically. So which country would report an export? A, Japan only, B, United States only, or C, both Japan and the United States? So this question was a little bit tricky. The correct answer is C. So an export is a good or service that is produced within a country's borders and then transported to another country. So the first one was easy. The Japanese manufacturer is exporting a good, but the U.S. toothpaste manufacturer is exporting a service, a manufacturing license, okay? So that was the key word there. So A is incorrect. Both are examples of exports, one a good, the other a service. B is incorrect because, again, both are examples of exports, one a good and the other a service. So the correct answer is C, both Japan and the United States. So just quickly, I'm in the learning ecosystem. I'm in the practice mode, and you can see economics of international trade. I did the 47 questions, 83, so I'm on track for the exam. I'm going to click in here to review the category. Again, I can filter, and I want to look at my incorrect answers, and that's going to bring them up. You can see I had 8 incorrect, and then this was the question that I just showed you that I got incorrect. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to review it. I had answered A. I didn't understand that a license is exporting a service, so that's why I made my mistake. And then I can go back and I can learn more about the learning outcome statement. So again, I'm going to have to kind of scan through here and see where I can pick it up. Now again, it may not be totally clear to you at first blush, and that is why it's very important to do all the practice questions in the learning ecosystem, because sometimes you're picking up something in the solution to the answer that's not exactly clear in the text, but these questions and answers are considered to be part of the curriculum that is then tested on the exam. So I just wanted to point out this question as an expert question. Not on the exam, there's going to be a similar range of questions going from easy to moderate to difficult to expert. They're not going to be all the expert questions on the exam, but in general, on average, you want to make sure that you're getting over 70% in each of the categories. And when you do get an expert question wrong, go back and think about it, and you'll pick up something. Oh, it's an export. They're exporting a service. It's a manufacturing license. Okay, that's an example of exporting a service. And then if a question, you might get a question on the exam that's kind of similar but a little bit different, and that's the part of the learning process. Learning outcome statement D is describe why a country runs a current account deficit and describe the effect of a current account deficit on the country's currency. Okay, so this slide starts with a question: is running a current account deficit a bad sign? And should all countries aim at maximizing their current account balance? Well, the answer to both questions is not necessarily. First, the sum of the current account balances of all countries is by definition equal to 0. So it is impossible for all countries to have a current account surplus. Second, a current account deficit must be put in context before drawing conclusions. A developing country may run a current account deficit because it needs to import many products and services. Alternatively, a mature economy may run a current account deficit because its consumption far exceeds its production and its ability to export. There is a long-running debate about the risk for a country of running a persistent current account deficit. Some economists argue that as long as foreign entities are willing to continue holding the assets and the currency of a country with a current account deficit, running a current account deficit does not matter. But what if foreign entities become unwilling to hold the assets and the currency of the country running a current account deficit? Consider the example of the country running the largest current account deficit, the United States. Other countries hold U.S. dollars, and they can be held as bank deposits in the United States, or they can be invested. But if other countries decide that they want to reduce their exposure to the United States, they may start selling U.S. assets, which will have a negative effect on the price of these assets. In addition, they may decide to convert their US dollars into other currencies, which will cause a depreciation of the US dollar relative to other currencies. Foreign currencies will get stronger relative to the US dollar, a situation referred to as an appreciation of foreign currencies relative to the US dollar. In response to countries selling US assets, the Federal Reserve Board, or the Fed, which is the US central bank, may increase interest rates to encourage entities in other countries to invest in the United States. An increase in interest rates would increase the cost of financing for individuals, companies, and the government in the United States. The combination of lower asset prices, a weaker US dollar, and higher interest rates would likely hurt the US economy, potentially leading to lower GDP, maybe even recession and higher unemployment. Okay, another practice question from the learning ecosystem at the expert level. So you can see these are a little bit tricky. I'm just putting these in at the expert level to reinforce the fact that you need to practice and review from your mistakes, okay? So a German company, the question is, a German company purchases a production facility in Canada financed by a loan from a Canadian bank. The production facility transports all of its output to Ireland. Which of the following statements regarding the balance of payment accounts for the two countries is most appropriate? A, the payment of interest is recorded as an outflow in Germany's capital account. B, the purchase of the facility is recorded as an inflow in Canada's capital account. Or C, the goods transported to Ireland are recorded as exports in Germany's current account. Okay, this is a pretty good question because you have to pay attention to the details, and it shows the importance of reading very carefully, okay? So the correct answer is B, and I don't think it was too difficult because we're talking about a German company purchasing a production facility in Canada, and that would be recorded as an inflow into Canada's capital account and an outflow in Germany's capital account. So it's definitely capital flowing originating from Germany. It's a German company purchasing a production facility in Canada. So this financed by a loan from a Canadian bank, that's what we call red herring information. It's put in there to kind of confuse you, but the big picture is it's a German company buying a production facility in Canada. So answer B is most correct. Now, if you look at A, it's saying the payment of interest is recorded as an outflow in Germany's capital account. And this is what I said you have to read very carefully because interest payments fall under the current account, not the capital account. So that just that one word is making answer A to be wrong. And then if we look at answer C, the goods transported to Ireland are recorded as exports in Germany's current account. No, the goods are being made in Canada and they're being sent to Ireland. So they're an export from Canada, they're an import to Ireland, and it has not affecting the Germany's current account. So I wanted to put that question in there just to show you the importance of reading very carefully. And in fact, in this case, it's just one word can make the difference between an answer being right or being wrong. And that's often the case in the CFA Investment Foundations or indeed the CFA program as well. Now we're moving on to Learning Outcome Statement E, which is describe types of foreign exchange rate systems. So in this Learning Outcome Statement, we're going to learn about fixed exchange rate systems, floating exchange rate systems, and managed floating exchange rate systems, okay? So starting with the fixed exchange rate system, international trade requires payments which involve an exchange of currencies and are thus affected by foreign exchange rates and foreign exchange rate systems. A fixed exchange rate system or regime, we're going to show an example. At the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, the major nations of the Western world agreed to an exchange rate system in which the value of the US dollar was defined as $35 per ounce of gold. In other words, a dollar was equivalent to 1/35 of an ounce of gold. All other currencies were defined or pegged in terms of the US dollars. The advantage of a fixed exchange rate system is that it eliminates currency risk or foreign exchange risk, which is the risk associated with the fluctuation of exchange rates. Therefore, importers and exporters know with greater certainty the amount that they will pay or receive for the goods or services they trade. A disadvantage is that as the competitiveness of economies change over time, an economy that becomes uncompetitive will see its current account balance worsen because its currency becomes overvalued. Okay? Its exports are too expensive from the buyer's perspective, and its imports are too cheap from the seller's perspective. Under a fixed exchange rate system, the only solution to this problem is for the country to formally devalue its currency. Devaluation is the decision made by a country's central bank to decrease the value of the domestic currency relative to other currencies, an action that many governments are reluctant to undertake. To overcome the disadvantages of a fixed exchange rate regime, the Bretton Woods system was abandoned in 1973, and currency values were left to market forces. Okay? So in a pure floating exchange rate system, the central bank does not intervene, and it lets the market determine the value of its currency. That is, the exchange rate between the domestic currency and the foreign currencies is only driven by supply and demand for each currency. In a managed floating exchange rate system, a central bank intervenes to stabilize its currency. It buys domestic currency using its foreign currency reserves to strengthen its domestic currency, or it buys foreign currency using its domestic currency to weaken its domestic currency. So, for example, in the wake of the European sovereign debt crisis in 2012, many investors converted their euros into Swiss francs, viewing the Swiss franc as a safer currency than the euro. The strengthening of the Swiss franc started eroding the competitiveness of Swiss exporters and pushed the Swiss National Bank, Switzerland's central bank, to intervene. To drive the price of the Swiss franc down, the Swiss National Bank sold its domestic currency and bought foreign currencies such as the euro. The Swiss National Bank did the opposite of what investors were doing. In the process, it accumulated foreign currency reserves. This example shows that central banks do not usually aim for a completely fixed exchange rate, but typically try to maintain the value of their country's currency within a certain range. Central banks typically intervene infrequently, so generally such a system operates as a floating exchange rate system. Again, just to bring the real world into the classroom to complement the CFA Institute Investment Foundation's program curriculum, here I am again at the Bank of Canada website. Recall in the chapter for macroeconomics, we looked at the Bank of Canada website because we were looking at the monetary policy, and we know that the objective was to keep inflation low, and that they had an inflation control target between 2%, which is the midpoint between 1% and 3%. Okay, so on the same page, if we scroll down more, there's information about Canada's flexible exchange rate. So Canada's flexible exchange rate, or floating dollar, permits us to pursue an independent monetary policy that is best suited to Canada's economic circumstances and is focused on achieving the inflation target. So Canada has an inflation target. Movements in the exchange rate also provide a buffer, helping our economy to absorb and adjust to external and internal shocks. So here, there's a nice backgrounder on the exchange rate. If you click on it, some important information. It's only 3 pages. You can see the exchange rate is the price of one national currency, such as the Canadian dollar, expressed in the terms of another currency, for example, the US dollar, or a basket of currencies. So for very open, trade-dependent countries like Canada, the external value of the currency is particularly relevant as it affects, among other things, the prices and the volume of goods and services we export and import. Specifically, a depreciation fall or appreciation rise in the external value of the Canadian dollar will make Canadian goods or services less or more expensive to foreign buyers, and this will tend to boost or restrain their demand for our products. Okay, so what determines the exchange rate? You can see Canada has a flexible exchange rate system because we have a target for inflation that aims to preserve the domestic value of the Canadian dollar, the central bank cannot also have a target for its external value. So there is no set fixed value for the Canadian currency in terms of another currency. Okay, the exchange rate for the Canadian dollar against the US dollar, and indeed against any other currency, floats and is determined by the demand for and supply of Canadian dollars in the foreign exchange market. Okay, so quite important. And it says here, if we scroll down, the role of the exchange rate in monetary policy. Although there is no target for the Canadian dollar and the bank no longer intervenes in foreign exchange markets, except in very exceptional circumstances, the bank is not indifferent to persistent currency movements up or down and takes into their account their effect together with that of other domestic and external factors on total demand and inflation in Canada. So again, I just want to show you that bringing the real world into the classroom when we're talking about monetary policy in the chapter on macroeconomics, go and look at the Bank of Canada. Similarly, when we're talking about flexible exchange rate regimes, have a look at a central bank. In this case, I'm using Canada again, and it gives you some pretty good information in the background around the exchange rate. Learning outcome statement F is describe factors affecting the value of the currency. So there's 5 factors that are listed. Number 1 is the balance of payments, can affect exchange rates. Number 2, the level of inflation can affect exchange rates. Number 3, the level of interest rates can affect exchange rates. Also the level of government debt, and finally political and economic environment. Okay, so when we first look at the balance of payments, a current account deficit tends to lead to a depreciation of the currency. Therefore, a current account surplus is going to lead to an appreciation. So you have to understand, the opposite. High levels of inflation tend to lead to a depreciation of the domestic currency. Therefore, low inflation is going to tend to lead to an appreciation. When we look at the level of interest rates, how they affect exchange rates, higher interest rates tend to lead to an appreciation of the domestic currency. So ask yourself why. Because if a country has higher interest rates, people from other countries may want to invest in that country to earn those higher interest rates, so they will have to buy that currency. That creates demand for the currency. Increase in demand for the currency is going to lead to an appreciation. Okay, so moving on to levels of government debt. High government debt tends to lead to a depreciation of the currency. Therefore, low government debt levels may tend to lead to an appreciation. And finally, looking at political and economic environment, political instability and poor economic prospects tend to lead to a depreciation of the domestic currency. So the opposite of that would be political stability and good economic prospects would tend to lead to an appreciation of a domestic currency. Learning outcome statement G is describe how to assess the relative strength of currencies. So we look at purchasing power parity, PPP, and purchasing power parity is an economic theory based on the principle that a basket of goods in 2 different countries should cost the same after taking into account the exchange rate between the 2 currencies. So the concept of purchasing power parity has long been used to explain relative currency valuations, that is, whether currencies are fairly valued relative to each other. Okay, this slide is looking at the limits on the ability to take advantage of different prices in different countries. So the example that they're showing in the text is the same automobile is $3,000 cheaper in Mexico. And indeed, that is the case in Canada. Quite often, the price of a car in Canada is much more expensive than you would find it in the States after taking into account the exchange rate, okay? But there are limits on the ability to take advantage of different prices. The first one is import and export restrictions. So restrictions such as tariffs, quotas, and non-tariff barriers may make it difficult to buy products in one market and bring them into another. And indeed, bringing a car in from the United States into Canada, there are certain restrictions and things that you have to do, and perhaps duties and taxes that need to be paid. Okay, so in general, there are import and export restrictions that will limit the ability to take advantage of different prices in different countries. Another thing is transportation costs. The gains from arbitrage, that's riskless profit, are limited if it is expensive to transport products from one market to another. That'll increase the cost. And finally, looking at perishable products, it may be impractical or difficult to transfer products from one market to another. Learning outcome statement H is describe foreign exchange rate quotes. Okay, so when we're looking at buying and selling foreign exchange, it's not a lot different than buying and selling stocks. There's going to be a bid exchange rate, or the bid rate, and that's the exchange rate at which the bank or the currency dealer will buy the foreign currency, and it's the low value. And the offer exchange rate, or the offer rate, also called the ask exchange rate or ask rate, is the exchange rate at which the bank or dealer will sell the foreign currency. It's the high value. Just remember, buy low, sell high. What's a dealer or bank going to do with regards to currency? They're going to buy low and sell high. And the difference between the bid and offer rates is known as the bid-offer spread. Okay? So a quick practice check question to check our understanding. I don't think this is saying it's expert, but I don't think this one is too difficult. The question is, a Swiss tourist is returning home after visiting Mexico and finds herself with 25,000 Mexican pesos remaining. Her local bank quotes her the following exchange rates. Bid, CHF, that's Confederation Helvetia or Swiss franc, 0.0728 to 1 Mexican peso. And the offer is Swiss francs 0.0732, which is a higher number. The offer is higher than the bid, to 1 Mexican peso. So in converting her Mexican pesos to Swiss francs, the bank will apply the A, bid rate, B, offer rate, or C, a rate that is halfway between the bid and offer rates. Okay, this question is expert in the learning ecosystem, but I don't think it's all that difficult if you just talk your way through it. So the Swiss tourist is returning home to Switzerland. That's her home country. And she has 25,000 Mexican pesos. And so she wants to sell the pesos to buy Swiss francs. So in converting her Mexican pesos to Swiss francs, the bank is, of course, going to apply the bid rate. The correct answer is A. The bank will be buying the Mexican pesos, so it'll apply the bid rate, buy low, sell high. Okay? So again, I don't think that question is too difficult. But one of the things that I wanted to point out to you is just to show you that when you see this type of a quotation, CHF 0.0728 to the MXN, always to make it easy to understand, just write in number 1. That's 1 Mexican peso. So 1 Mexican peso in this case is equal to 0.0728 Swiss francs. Okay, so we could look at a scenario where they're going to ask you, has the currency appreciated or depreciated, and they're giving it to you in the form of a fraction with a numerator and denominator. When you're looking at the denominator, just put the number 1 and write it out this way. So for example, if the exchange rate moved to 0.0735 MXN, okay, so the way that would look in terms of the question would be CHF here and MXN here. I'm going to rewrite that as 1 MXN equals 0.0735. So in this case, you can see 1 Mexican peso is getting me more Swiss francs. In the past, it got me 0.728. Now I'm getting 0.735. That's a higher number. 1 Mexican peso getting me more Swiss francs. That means the Mexican peso has appreciated and the Swiss franc has depreciated. So I use that question. Number 1, it's expert, but I think it's pretty easy. Number 2, I wanted to show you the format that quotations are given in, and to remind you that in the denominator, just add the number 1, rewrite it this way, and if you do it like that, you'll understand, 1 Mexican peso is getting me more Swiss francs. You'll understand, has the currency appreciated or depreciated, okay? So we're down to the final learning outcome statement, and it's learning outcome statement I, which is compare spot and forward markets. So the foreign exchange market is where currencies are traded. It's a very active and liquid market with an average of $5 trillion traded every single day. So it's a decentralized network that is highly integrated via information and computer technology. Foreign exchange transactions may take place in the spot market or in the forward market. So you have to understand the difference between the two. The spot market is where currencies are traded now and delivered immediately on the spot. The exchange rate for the transaction is called the spot exchange rate or spot rate. In contrast, the forward market is where currencies are traded now but delivered at some future date, such as 1 month or 3 months from now. The exchange rate for the transaction is called the foreign exchange rate or forward rate, and there are as many forward rates as there are delivery dates, okay? So for example, there is a 1 month forward rate for delivery in 1 month, a 2 month forward rate for delivery in 2 months, and so on. Gaining certainty about foreign exchange transactions by using the forward market is important for companies because it enables them to ensure that they can meet future cash outflows such as operating expenses and interest payments. Although most companies prefer to focus on trading their products and services profitably rather than focus on the intricacies of buying and selling currencies. So just to understand how the forward market works, the transaction is going to be done today for the currencies to be exchanged at some time in the future, 1 month or 2 months, but the rate at which they're exchanged at that time is that rate is agreed upon and established at today's date. So the rate is established and set, but the actual exchange of the currency is not until the future. So that gives the companies or individuals the ability to know with certainty what the exchange rate, with the transaction, the exchange rate for the transaction that's going to be done in the future. Okay. So we're going to finish this video with one last practice question just to check our understanding, and this is from the difficult level. It says the question is on 1 May, a Swedish automaker purchases electronic equipment from a manufacturer in the United Kingdom. The invoice is denominated in British pounds with payment due in 90 days. On the 1st of May, the automaker enters into a 3-month forward contract with a currency dealer. In 3 months, the currency dealer will sell the automaker British pounds at the A, spot rate in effect on 1 May, B, the spot rate in effect on 29 July, which is 90 days later, or C, the 3-month forward rate in effect on 1st of May. Actually, I don't think that question is all that difficult. So C is correct. A forward currency contract is an agreement to exchange currency at a predetermined rate on a future date, but no actual transaction takes place on the day the forward contract is initiated. In 3 months, the currency dealer will provide the Swedish company with pounds at the previously agreed on rate, i.e. the forward rate in effect on the 1st of May, and the Swedish company will pay the invoiced amount to the UK manufacturer. So that's a nice little example just to show you the difference between the spot rate. The spot rate, currency is exchanged on the spot at the rate on that day. But when we're looking at a forward rate agreement, the rate is agreed on that day for exchange of currencies at some point in the future. Okay, and that ends the learning outcome statements and the slides for this chapter. And that is the conclusion for this video, which was on Module 3, Inputs and Tools, Chapter 6, Economics of International Trade for the CFA Institute Investment Foundations Program. Thank you.